The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the small island of Eryndale in an oppressive shroud. Dr. Isla Morgan stood at the bow of the ferry, her eyes straining to pierce the murky veil that obscured her destination. The salty air clung to her skin, and the rhythmic drone of the engine was the only sound that punctuated the eerie silence. As the ferry neared the island's lone pier, Isla caught glimpses of dilapidated buildings and abandoned fishing boats. Eryndale had once been a prosperous fishing village, but now it seemed more like a ghost town. The reports of strange marine phenomena and unexplained occurrences had piqued her interest, drawing her to this remote outpost like a moth to a flame. The ferry's horn blared, startling Isla from her reverie. She gathered her equipment and disembarked, her boots creaking on the weathered planks of the pier. A solitary figure awaited her arrival, an old man with a face as craggy as the island's shoreline. "Dr. Morgan, I presume?" the man called out, his voice gruff and weary. Isla nodded, extending her hand. "Yes, that's me, and you must be Mr. Caleb." The old man's handshake was firm, his palm calloused from years of working the sea. "Aye, that I am. Welcome to Eryndale, though I can't say it's much of a welcome these days." As they walked along the pier, Caleb's eyes darted nervously towards the harbor. Isla followed his gaze but saw nothing except the swirling mists that seemed to thicken with each passing moment. "I must warn you, Dr. Morgan," Caleb said, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "This island ain't what it used to be. Strange things happen here, especially when the fog comes in thick like this." Isla offered a reassuring smile. "Mr. Caleb, I'm a scientist. I've come here to study the unusual marine life and oceanic patterns. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for whatever's been happening." The old man's face darkened. "Logical, you say? There's nothing logical about ships that sail without a crew, or the voices that call from the depths on moonless nights." Isla's scientific mind immediately began formulating hypotheses. Underwater caves creating acoustic anomalies, bioluminescent organisms giving the illusion of ghostly ships. But something in Caleb's tone gave her pause. There was a gravity to his words, a weight of experience that couldn't be easily dismissed. As they reached the end of the pier, Isla saw the village proper for the first time. Most of the buildings were boarded up, their paint peeling and their roofs sagging under years of neglect. A few dim lights flickered in windows here and there, hinting at the handful of residents who still called Eryndale home. "I've arranged for you to stay at the old lighthouse keeper's cottage," Caleb said, pointing to a squat stone building perched on a rocky outcropping. "It's not much, but it's got a good view of the harbor, though some nights you might wish it didn't." Isla thanked him and began the trek up the winding path to the cottage. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from behind curtained windows. The villagers, it seemed, were as wary of her as they were of the sea itself. The cottage was sparse but functional. Isla quickly set up her equipment: laptops, water testing kits, and various sensors designed to monitor oceanic conditions. As night fell, she sat at the small desk by the window, reviewing her research notes and planning the next day's activities. It was just past midnight when she heard it, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Isla rose from her chair and peered out the window. The fog had grown even thicker, if that were possible. But there was something else. A faint, otherworldly glow emanated from the harbor. Heart pounding, Isla grabbed her jacket and a flashlight. Scientific curiosity overwhelmed caution as she made her way down to the shore. The sound grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to speak of ancient sorrows and long-forgotten promises. As she reached the water's edge, the fog parted like a curtain, revealing a sight that defied all rational explanation. There, gliding silently into the harbor, was a ship unlike any Isla had ever seen. Its hull was pale, almost translucent, and it seemed to emit a soft, ghostly light. The sails, tattered and ancient, billowed in a wind that Isla couldn't feel. Aboard the deck, figures moved with an unnatural grace. They were dressed in tattered white garments, their faces obscured by the mist. But as one turned towards the shore, Isla caught a glimpse of hollow eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. Isla stood transfixed, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This was impossible, and yet... The ship drew closer, and with it came a feeling of inexorable pull. The haunting melody grew stronger, and Isla found herself taking a step towards the water. "Dr. Morgan." A harsh whisper cut through the night. Isla turned to see Caleb, his face a mask of fear. "Get away from the shore now." The urgency in his voice broke the spell. Isla stumbled backward, her heart racing. As suddenly as it had appeared, the ghostly ship vanished, swallowed once more by the impenetrable fog. Caleb grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the water. "I told you, didn't I? This is no place for scientists and their logical explanations. The Pale Ones have seen you now, and they don't take kindly to outsiders." "The Pale Ones?" Isla's voice trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. What were those things?" Caleb's eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "They're the price we pay for our ancestors' greed, a debt that can never be fully settled." He looked out over the harbor, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And now that they've seen you, I fear you've become part of that debt." As they hurried back towards the village, Isla's mind raced. Everything she knew, everything she believed about the natural world, had been upended in a single night. But one thing was clear. There were secrets in Eryndale, ancient and terrible secrets that the sea itself seemed determined to keep. In the days that followed, Isla threw herself into her research with renewed vigor. By day, she collected water samples, analyzed tidal patterns, and interviewed the few villagers willing to speak with her. But each night, as the fog rolled in, she found herself drawn to the window of her cottage, watching and waiting for the pale ships to return. The villagers, once merely suspicious, now regarded her with open hostility. Doors slammed shut as she passed, and conversations fell to hushed whispers. Only Caleb seemed willing to speak with her, though his words were often cryptic and filled with dire warnings. "The sea has marked you," he told her one evening as they sat in the village's lone pub. "It's only a matter of time before it calls you to join them." Isla wanted to dismiss his words as superstition, but the memory of that ghostly ship and its otherworldly crew haunted her dreams. She began to notice strange occurrences, her equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason, the tides shifting unpredictably, and eerie sounds echoing across the water on still nights. As she delved deeper into Eryndale's history, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every few decades, a stranger would arrive on the island, drawn by rumors of scientific anomalies or hidden treasures. And invariably, those strangers would vanish without a trace, their disappearances coinciding with particularly dense fogs and sightings of the pale ships. One stormy afternoon, as Isla pored over old town records in the musty confines of the village hall, she came across a faded document that made her blood run cold. It was a contract, dated centuries ago, between the village elders and a Captain Marsh. The language was archaic and much of it indecipherable, but certain phrases stood out with chilling clarity. In exchange for boundless prosperity and protection from the sea's wrath, a tithe to be paid in souls once per generation, until the debt is paid in full. The implications were staggering. Had the village actually made a pact with some supernatural entity? And if so, what did that mean for Isla and her research? As she left the village hall, clutching her notes tightly, Isla felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The fog was rolling in early today, thick tendrils of mist creeping through the narrow streets. And carried on the damp air was the faint sound of bells, ship's bells ringing out a mournful dirge. Isla quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come to Eryndale seeking scientific truth, but now she found herself embroiled in something far beyond the realm of rational explanation. The pale ships were real, the curse was real, and somehow she had become entangled in a centuries-old bargain that demanded payment in blood and souls. As she reached the lighthouse cottage, Isla made a decision. She would not flee, as every instinct screamed for her to do. Instead, she would see this through to the end, whatever that might be. She was a scientist, after all, and if there was a mystery to be solved, a curse to be broken, then she would be the one to do it. But as night fell and the fog thickened, Isla couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer the observer in this strange equation. She had become part of the experiment itself, a variable in some cosmic calculation that she was only beginning to understand. And somewhere out in the mist-shrouded harbor, the pale ships waited, their ghostly crews standing silent vigil. They had all the time in the world, these spirits of the deep, for they knew, as surely as the tides, that all debts must eventually be paid. As Isla drifted off into an uneasy sleep, the sound of distant bells echoed across the water, a reminder that in Eryndale, the line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was as thin and shifting as the fog itself. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of research and increasingly disturbing discoveries. Isla found herself caught between her scientific training and the undeniable reality of what she had witnessed that foggy night. The ghostly ships, the pale ones, they defied all logical explanation, yet she could not dismiss them as mere hallucination or local superstition. Her days were spent collecting data, water samples that revealed inexplicable chemical compositions, tidal charts that seemed to follow no natural pattern, and marine life that exhibited behaviors unseen anywhere else in the world. But it was her nights that truly tested her resolve. Every evening, as darkness fell and the fog rolled in, Isla would hear the distant tolling of ships' bells. Sometimes she caught glimpses of pale, spectral vessels gliding silently through the mist. And always, there was the music, a haunting melody that seemed to call to something deep within her soul. One particularly gloomy afternoon, Isla decided to interview some of the older villagers, hoping to glean more information about Eryndale's troubled past. Most doors remained firmly shut, but she eventually found herself in the cramped living room of Martha Blackwood, a woman whose family had lived on the island for generations. Martha's rheumy eyes fixed on Isla with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You shouldn't have come here, girl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sea doesn't like outsiders prying into its secrets." "Please, Mrs. Blackwood," Isla pressed. "I need to understand what's happening here. The ships, the pale ones, what are they?" The old woman sighed, her gnarled hands clutching a worn shawl tightly around her shoulders. "They are the price of our ancestors' folly," she said. "A bargain struck long ago, when Eryndale was nothing more than a struggling fishing village." Martha's tale painted a grim picture of desperation and dark magic. Centuries ago, as the village faced starvation due to dwindling fish stocks, the elders had sought out a mysterious sea captain named Ezekiel Marsh. Marsh promised them boundless prosperity from the sea in exchange for what he called a modest tithe. But it wasn't gold or silver he wanted, Martha continued, her voice trembling. It was souls. One soul every generation to join his crew for all eternity. The elders, blinded by the promise of wealth and abundance, had agreed. A contract was signed in blood, binding the village to this terrible pact. For a time, Eryndale flourished. The waters teemed with fish, and trade brought unprecedented riches to the once impoverished community. But the price was steep. Every few decades, when the fog grew thick and the pale ships appeared, someone would vanish, usually a newcomer to the island, someone who wouldn't be missed. The villagers turned a blind eye, convincing themselves it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. "But the sea is greedy," Martha said, her eyes filling with tears. And Captain Marsh's appetite grew with each soul claimed. Now the ships come more frequently, and the fog never truly leaves. As Isla left Martha's house, her mind reeling from the old woman's tale, she noticed the streets were eerily empty. The few villagers she did see hurried past with averted eyes, as if afraid to acknowledge her presence. The atmosphere of fear and secrecy that permeated Eryndale was palpable. Back in her cottage, Isla pored over her notes, trying to reconcile Martha's story with the scientific data she had collected. The chemical anomalies in the water, the strange behavior of marine life. Could they all be tied to this centuries-old pact? As night fell and the familiar fog began to creep in, Isla made a decision. She needed to see the pale ships up close, to document their existence with more than just her fallible human senses. Setting up her most sensitive equipment, cameras with night vision capabilities, audio recorders, and various sensors, she prepared to spend the night on the shore. The hours ticked by slowly. Isla huddled on the rocky beach, her equipment arrayed around her like technological talismans against the encroaching supernatural. The fog thickened until she could barely see a few feet in front of her. And then it happened. The ghostly bells began to toll, and through the mist she saw them, the pale ships gliding into the harbor with an otherworldly grace. Isla's hands shook as she operated her cameras, capturing footage that she knew would revolutionize our understanding of the world. If only she could share it. But as the ships drew closer, something changed. The haunting melody that always accompanied their arrival grew louder, more insistent. Isla felt a tugging sensation in her chest, an irresistible pull towards the water's edge. Through the swirling mist, she saw figures moving on the decks of the spectral vessels. The pale ones, gaunt, ethereal beings, dressed in tattered white garments. Their hollow eyes seemed to fix on her, and in that moment, Isla understood the true nature of the bargain that bound Eryndale. The pale ones were not just ghostly sailors or demons of the deep. They were the souls of those who had been sacrificed over the centuries, bound to Captain Marsh's eternal crew. And they were calling to her, offering release from the burdens of the mortal world, promising knowledge beyond human comprehension. Isla found herself wading into the frigid water, her equipment forgotten on the shore. The cold shocked her system, breaking the spell momentarily. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dr. Morgan!" The shout came from behind her. Isla turned to see Caleb running down the beach, his face a mask of terror. "Get away from the water." His arrival seemed to dispel some of the supernatural energy that had gripped the harbor. The pale ships began to recede, fading back into the mist from whence they came. The ghostly music faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the night. Waves lapping at the shore, wind rustling through the sparse vegetation. Caleb helped Isla back to dry land, his weathered face etched with concern. "I warned you," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "The sea has marked you now. It won't let you go easily." As they gathered her equipment, much of which had been rendered useless by exposure to the damp air, Isla's scientific mind battled with what she had experienced. The pull she had felt, the knowledge offered by the pale ones. It challenged everything she had ever believed about the nature of reality. "Why?" she asked Caleb as they trudged back towards the village. "Why am I being drawn into this? I'm not from Eryndale. I'm not part of your pact." The old man's eyes were sad as he regarded her. "The contract doesn't care where you're from, Dr. Morgan. It only knows that a price must be paid. And you're an outsider, someone who won't be missed, just like all the others who came before." Isla spent the rest of the night reviewing the scant evidence she had managed to capture. Most of her recordings were distorted, filled with static and strange, otherworldly sounds. But a few images had come through, blurry, indistinct shapes that could almost be ships, glowing faintly in the fog. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Isla knew she couldn't leave Eryndale now, not when she was so close to unraveling its mysteries. But more than that, she felt a responsibility to break this cycle of sacrifice and suffering. There had to be a way to end the curse without condemning another soul to join the pale ones. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Isla made a resolution. She would find a way to communicate with Captain Marsh, to renegotiate the terms of the contract. And if that failed, she would find a way to break it entirely, whatever the cost. But first she needed more information. The village records she had accessed only told part of the story. There had to be more. Hidden documents, oral histories passed down through generations, perhaps even physical evidence of the supernatural events that plagued Eryndale. Isla spent the next few days combing through every inch of the village. She explored abandoned buildings, pored over forgotten papers in dusty attics, and continued to press the reluctant villagers for information. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The contract with Captain Marsh was more than just a simple exchange of souls for prosperity. It was a complex magical working that had fundamentally altered the nature of Eryndale and the surrounding waters. The abundance of fish, the protection from storms, these were not just boons granted by a capricious supernatural entity. They were the result of the island being partially shifted into another realm, a liminal space between the world of the living and the domain of the dead. This explained the strange phenomena Isla had been documenting, the inexplicable chemical compositions in the water, the bizarre behavior of marine life, the unpredictable tides. Eryndale existed in two worlds simultaneously, and the pale ships were the heralds of this otherworldly intrusion. But this knowledge came at a price. The more Isla uncovered, the more the village turned against her. Doors that had once been merely closed were now barred and locked. Whispered conversations fell silent at her approach. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes following her every move. One evening, as she was returning to her cottage after another day of fruitless research, Isla found her path blocked by a group of villagers. Their faces were grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "You need to leave, Dr. Morgan," one of them said, a burly fisherman whose name Isla couldn't recall. "Your presence here is disrupting the natural order of things." Isla stood her ground despite the hammering of her heart. "There's nothing natural about what's happening here," she countered. "You're sacrificing innocent people to maintain a bargain that should never have been made in the first place." "You don't understand," another villager, an elderly woman, pleaded. "If the contract is broken, we'll lose everything. The sea will reclaim what it's owed, with interest. The entire island could be swallowed up." As the villagers argued amongst themselves, unsure of how to proceed, a familiar figure pushed through the crowd. Caleb, his face haggard and his eyes bloodshot, placed himself between Isla and the angry mob. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of respect. "The girl stays. She's under my protection." The villagers grumbled but dispersed, shooting dark looks over their shoulders as they retreated. Caleb turned to Isla, his expression grave. "You're playing with forces you don't understand, Dr. Morgan," he said. "But I fear it's too late to turn back now. Come with me. There's something you need to see." Caleb led Isla to his home, a small, weather-beaten cottage near the harbor. Inside, he retrieved a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. The box was intricately carved with nautical symbols and sealed with a complex lock. "This has been passed down through my family for generations," Caleb explained as he worked to open the lock. "We were tasked with keeping it safe, hidden from both the villagers and the sea." When the box finally opened, Isla gasped. Inside was a collection of documents, letters, maps, and what appeared to be pages torn from a ship's log. But what caught her attention was a small, leather-bound book that seemed to pulse with an inner light. "This," Caleb said, holding up the book with trembling hands, "is Captain Ezekiel Marsh's personal grimoire. It contains the original text of the contract, as well as the supernatural knowledge he used to bind Eryndale to the realm of the Pale Ones." Isla reached for the book, her scientific skepticism warring with an almost mystical reverence. As her fingers brushed the leather cover, she felt a jolt of energy course through her body. Images flashed before her eyes, roiling seas, spectral ships, and a figure standing at the helm, his face hidden beneath a captain's hat. "Be careful," Caleb warned, his voice seeming to come from far away. "The book has a mind of its own. It won't reveal its secrets easily, and the knowledge it contains comes at a great cost." As Isla leafed through the grimoire, she realized the magnitude of what she held in her hands. This was the key to understanding the supernatural forces at work in Eryndale. But more than that, it might hold the solution to breaking the curse once and for all. But as she delved deeper into the arcane text, a chill wind began to blow through the cottage. The temperature dropped precipitously, and Isla could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Outside, the fog began to roll in, thicker and more impenetrable than she had ever seen it. Caleb rushed to the window, his face pale with fear. "It's him," he whispered. "Captain Marsh. He knows we have the grimoire." As if in response to Caleb's words, a bone-chilling howl rose from the direction of the harbor. It was a sound of rage and power, of ancient magic disturbed and dark forces awakened. The very foundations of the cottage seemed to shake. Isla clutched the grimoire to her chest, her mind racing. She had wanted answers, and now she had them, or at least the means to find them. But at what cost? Had her pursuit of knowledge doomed Eryndale and its inhabitants? As the unearthly wail grew louder, drowning out all other sounds, Isla knew that she had reached a point of no return. The final confrontation was at hand. Armed with the grimoire and her own determination, She would have to face Captain Marsh and the full might of the supernatural forces that held Eryndale in their grip. The fate of the island, and perhaps her very soul, hung in the balance. And as the fog closed in and the spectral ships began to materialize in the harbor, Isla steeled herself for the battle to come. For she knew that in Eryndale, where the veil between worlds was thin, only one thing was certain: the sea would demand its due one way or another. The world outside Caleb's cottage had transformed into a maelstrom of supernatural energy. The fog, thicker than Isla had ever seen it, swirled with an otherworldly luminescence. The howling wind carried within it the anguished cries of countless lost souls, a cacophony of despair that threatened to overwhelm her senses. Isla clutched the grimoire tightly, its leather cover pulsing with an inner heat that seemed to match the frantic beating of her heart. Caleb stood by the window, his weathered face etched with lines of fear and resignation. "We need to get to the harbor," Isla shouted over the din. "It's the only way to end this." Caleb turned to her, his eyes wild. "You don't understand, girl. The harbor is the threshold between worlds now. Step foot there and you'll be in Marsh's domain." But Isla's mind was made up. With a determination born of both scientific curiosity and a newfound sense of responsibility to the people of Eryndale, she threw open the cottage door and plunged into the swirling mists. The journey to the harbor was like walking through a nightmare. The familiar streets of the village had become a twisted labyrinth, the buildings warping and shifting in impossible ways. Shadows danced at the edge of Isla's vision, taking on grotesque forms before dissolving back into the fog. As they neared the water's edge, the air grew heavy with the scent of brine and decay. The pale ships loomed before them, their spectral forms more solid and terrifying than Isla had ever seen them. Upon their decks, the pale ones stood in eerie silence, their hollow eyes fixed upon the two mortals who dared to approach. And there, standing at the end of the pier, was a figure that could only be Captain Ezekiel Marsh himself. He cut an imposing silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the finery of a naval officer long past its prime. But it was his face that caused Isla's breath to catch in her throat. Where features should have been, there was only a swirling void, as if the very essence of the fog had taken human form. "So," Marsh's voice boomed across the water, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've brought me my grimoire. How kind of you to return what is rightfully mine." Isla stepped forward, her legs trembling but her voice steady. "This ends now, Captain Marsh. I've read your book. I know the true nature of your bargain with Eryndale." A sound like grinding stones emanated from the captain. A laugh, Isla realized with a shudder. "No, you know nothing, foolish girl. You've glimpsed but a fraction of the power I wield, the secrets I've plumbed in the depths of realities your feeble mind cannot begin to comprehend." Marsh extended a hand, and Isla felt the grimoire tugging in her grasp, trying to return to its master. She held on with all her might, reciting in her mind the words of protection she had gleaned from its pages. "Your contract is flawed," Isla called out, her scientific mind racing to apply logic to the illogical situation before her. "You promised prosperity in exchange for souls, but you've been taking more than was agreed upon. The village is dying, Captain Marsh. Soon there will be no one left to pay your tithe." The captain's form seemed to ripple, the fog swirling more violently around him. "The contract is eternal, unbreakable. Eryndale's debt will be paid, even if I must drag this entire island into the depths to collect." As if in response to Marsh's words, the sea began to churn. Massive waves crashed against the shore, and Isla could see dark shapes moving beneath the surface, monstrous forms that defied description. Caleb, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "No more," he said, his voice carrying a weight of authority that Isla had never heard before. "For too long, we've turned a blind eye to your predations, Captain. We've sacrificed our neighbors, our friends, even our own family members to appease you. But no more." A ripple of energy seemed to pass through the gathered villagers. Isla hadn't even noticed their arrival, but now she saw them. Dozens of people emerging from the fog, their faces set with grim determination. Marsh's laughter boomed once more, tinged now with a note of uncertainty. "You dare to defy me? I, who have sailed the seas between worlds? I, who have bargained with entities your puny minds cannot even conceive?" Isla's scientific training warred with the supernatural reality before her. But in that moment, she understood what needed to be done. The grimoire had shown her the truth. The power of Marsh's contract lay not in arcane symbols or eldritch invocations, but in the belief of those it bound. "Your power is an illusion, Captain Marsh," Isla declared, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "You've held Eryndale in thrall not through some unbreakable mystical bond, but through fear and ignorance. The contract's true power comes from the villagers' belief in it, and beliefs can be changed." She turned to address the gathered crowd. "People of Eryndale, you are not bound by this curse. The prosperity you've enjoyed, the fish that fill your nets, these come not from Captain Marsh's magic, but from your own hard work and the natural bounty of the sea. You owe this specter nothing." A murmur ran through the crowd. Isla could see the doubt in their eyes, years of superstition and fear warring with the longing for freedom. She pressed on, her words carrying the weight of scientific conviction. "Look around you. The fog, the ghostly ships, these are not signs of some all-powerful entity. They're manifestations of quantum entanglement, of parallel realities bleeding into our own. Marsh hasn't given you protection from the sea's wrath. He's simply been manipulating the barrier between dimensions." As Isla spoke, she could feel the grimoire growing warmer in her hands. The arcane symbols on its pages began to glow, responding to the shift in belief occurring around her. Captain Marsh let out a roar of fury, the void of his face swirling violently. "Silence, you meddling fool. You understand nothing of the forces at work here." But Isla could see the effect her words were having. The pale ships seemed less substantial now, flickering like faulty holograms. The pale ones on their decks began to shift and change, their features becoming more distinct, more human. Caleb stepped forward, his voice joining Isla's. "She's right. We've allowed ourselves to be enslaved by our own fears. No more sacrifices, no more living in terror of the fog. Eryndale is ours, and we reclaim it now." A chorus of voices rose from the gathered villagers, centuries of pent-up defiance finally finding release. As their shouts grew louder, the very air seemed to shimmer and crack. Captain Marsh's form began to dissolve, the fog that comprised his body dispersing. "No," he howled, his voice fading. "The contract. The souls I've claimed." Isla opened the grimoire, its pages now blazing with ethereal light. "By the power vested in belief, by the strength of human will, and the inexorable march of scientific understanding, I declare this contract null and void." A blinding flash lit up the harbor, accompanied by a sound like reality itself tearing at the seams. Isla felt a rush of wind, and then silence. When her vision cleared, Isla found herself standing on a perfectly ordinary pier. The fog had lifted, revealing a calm sea under a star-filled sky. The pale ships were gone, as was any sign of Captain Marsh. But the transformation went beyond the supernatural elements. Isla could see color returning to the dilapidated buildings of Eryndale. The air felt fresher, filled with the natural sense of the ocean, rather than the cloying miasma that had permeated the island for so long. The villagers looked around in wonder as if seeing their home for the first time. Tears streamed down weathered faces, and laughter, true, joyous laughter, rang out across the water. Caleb approached Isla, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did it, Dr. Morgan, you freed us all." Isla looked down at the grimoire in her hands. Its pages were now blank, the arcane knowledge it had contained either spent or transformed into something new. "We did it," she corrected gently. "All of us, together." As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Isla felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with lingering awe. She had come to Eryndale seeking scientific truth, and had instead found herself at the intersection of quantum physics and folklore, of rational inquiry and ancestral belief. The mysteries of Eryndale were far from solved. Isla knew that her work here was just beginning. There would be papers to write, experiments to conduct, and a whole new understanding of reality to explore. But for now, as she stood on the pier watching fishing boats set out to sea without fear, for the first time in centuries, she allowed herself to simply marvel at the beauty of the unknown. Eryndale had been freed from its supernatural burden, But the island would always be a place where the veil between worlds was thin. And Isla, changed forever by her experiences, would be there to document whatever wonders, natural or otherwise, the future might hold. As the grimoire's final page turned to dust in her hands, carried away by the clean ocean breeze, Isla smiled. In the end, it wasn't eldritch knowledge or mystical power that had saved Eryndale. It was the most powerful force of all, the human capacity for growth, for challenging long-held beliefs in the face of new evidence. She turned to join the villagers in their celebration, her scientist's mind already formulating new hypotheses about the nature of reality. For in Eryndale, where the boundary between science and magic had proven so permeable, anything seemed possible. And as the newly liberated island of Eryndale embraced its uncertain but hopeful future, the last echoes of ghostly bells faded into memory, replaced by the joyous sounds of life renewed and mysteries yet to be explored.